all. Well, welcome. I'm Felisa Smith, so I'm the president-elect, or because of COVID, I guess the co-president of IBS during this year. And I'd like to welcome you all to the 5th seminar in the Vicky Funk lecture series. This is a monthly-ish online seminar sponsored by IBS with guest speakers, really wonderful guest speakers drawn from all around the world. The series is named after Dr. Vicky Funk, who was a founding member of the International Biogeography Society and its 4th president. Vicky was a senior research botanist and curator at the Smithsonian Natural History Museum, and well known for her foundational phylogenetic work on the compositae. She was just a wonderful scientist, colleague, and friend who was instrumental in the development of IBS, and so it was natural to name this lecture series after her. Today, we are really pleased to welcome Dr. Gretta Pecl, who is a professor of marine ecology, a Fulbright Fellow, an Australian Research Council Future Fellow, and since 2018, the director of the Center for Marine Socio-Ecology at the University of Tasmania. And it's really early in the morning there, so we're really grateful she's awake. Dr. Pecl studies the ecology of climate change in the marine realm, which is obviously something that's not particularly easy to do. Specifically, she focuses on characterizing the mechanisms that underlie the response of marine organisms to ongoing climate change. By integrating work across a variety of biological scales, she's able to explore the physiological and ecological mechanisms that underpin the large-scale redistribution of marine animals, not mammals. That was a Freudian slip on my part. She is a prolific and influential scientist. For example, her 2017 paper in Science on biodiversity redistribution under climate change impacts on ecosystems and human well-being has already been cited over 1,100 times in just the past 3 years. And Dr. Pecl has been deeply involved in science communication and engagement with the public. And in fact, she was instrumental in the development of a really interesting citizen science initiative called Redmap, the Range Extension Database and Mapping Project. This project encourages Australians to share sightings of marine species that are uncommon in their local seas. And then using the citizen science data collected by apparently thousands of volunteers, they've been able to map distributional changes in marine species as the climate changes and oceans warm. So we are really honored that Dr. Pecl has agreed to give this Funk lecture describing her work on the role of climate in driving the redistribution of species and marine systems. And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction, Felisa. Can people hear me okay? Got a nod or two, that's great. So yeah, thank you to Karen for organising this seminar and for the invitation from the Society to come along and talk about species redistribution in marine systems. I wanted to start off today with an acknowledgement of country. So today I'm speaking to you from Nipaluna Lutruwita, also known as Hobart, Tasmania, and I live and work on Aboriginal land, seas and waterways. And I acknowledge with deep respect the traditional owners of this land, the Muanina people, who belong to the oldest continuing culture in the world. They've cared and protected the country for thousands of years. So I pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and in particular the people that did not make elder status. So the Tasmanian Aboriginal community continue to care for country and for sea country today, and I really wanted to acknowledge their knowledge and their contribution. So today we'll be talking about impacts, adaptation and communication about climate-driven species redistribution. And I think it's a topic that's so fascinating to me because it is absolutely central to ecology, which was how I started my research journey in the first place. So what lives where and why is absolutely fundamental to ecology and to natural history, as everybody on this call knows. But the flora and fauna around us also form a really large part of our place attachment and our place dependence. And so I think that this issue of species and species redistribution is really important to many people in the general public as well, whether they consciously know that or not. And often people with greater place attachment also have greater engagement on climate change. And for somebody that's interested in engaging the public on climate change, I think this is a really potentially interesting piece of information and something that's of deep interest to me. In ecological terms, I'm very much a generalist. I have a splattergun approach of things that I work on, but I work mainly across impacts of climate change in physiology, ecology, and collaboration with a lot of modelling people. I work on adaptation in human systems and also communication. And that communication we try and, it's not just a performative go and do communication, it's actually a research endeavour that we engage in as well through collaborations with people that work in media and communication and psychologists as well. And so what I'll be presenting today is some highlights from our recent work or material that's in press or in review. But I will start with an overview of what we know about climate-driven redistribution and what some of the key challenges are. Quite a basic overview because it's an enormous topic with huge amounts of information coming out. I'll then go on to describe the extent and nature of changes around the Australian coastline in particular, before we take a bit of a deep dive into impacts and adaptation at a local scale, and that is the scale of my home state, Tasmania. And then we'll look at what's required for adaptation at a global scale before finishing off with a few slides about communicating about species on the move in terms of public and policy. So climate-driven global redistribution of species is pervasive across the planet. We know that the poleward movement on land is roughly around 17 kilometres a decade and on average, and 72 in the ocean. So it's a much faster process in the ocean, and species are also moving to greater depths in the ocean and then higher elevations on land. There's much less information about changes with depth than there are with latitude. But we do know that species changes are greatest where the climate has warmed the most. And where individual studies have looked at a particular taxa or a particular region, each one of those studies, which is what these blue bars there, have described at least 25 to 85% of species shifting. So where people are reporting species that are also not shifting, it looks like at least 25 to 85% of species are already changing their distribution. We know a little bit about what underpins some of that variation in rate and magnitude of shifts. Unfortunately, we know that at least 22% of that variation can be attributed to the methods that we're using to detect or to analyse that data. So that's a fair decent amount of variation there that can be described by the methodology that we're using to try and articulate these processes. So I think there needs to be a lot of work done in terms of how we can potentially standardise some of those approaches that we're using. Around 40% of the variation in rate and magnitude of shifts can be attributed to climate velocity, so that rate of change of the isotherm, how that shifts latitudinally through space. And around 57% can be described by that combination of climate velocity and species traits. Now, the traits that are influential in rate shifts do tend to be variable between regions and taxa, but in a particular study that we did in the southeast coast of Australia, we were able to show that widely distributed species like yellowtail kingfish and the southern Maori wrasse here were changing distribution much faster, and then lower trophic level species like the rock kale here also seem to be extending much more quickly. We also know that where there's agreement between the current speed and direction and the climate velocity, that again explains a greater percentage of the variation. So at a broad level, we are starting to get an understanding of what some of the key factors underpinning changes in the rate of the movement. There's also issues of detectability, obviously. whale sharks, if we see those changing distribution, it's much easier to notice those than, you know, tiny little barnacles or something. Ecological interactions also have a large impact. Habitat availability, if we have, you know, a coral obligate species that wants to shift further south, that's obviously not going to work unless the coral reef moves with it. And also the stage of shift being measured. So often I think we talk about range shifts, range extensions or contractions as if they're binary things that happened or they haven't. But in reality, it doesn't work in this way. And there's many, many stages, and we're talking about a process. So these shifts do go through a period where there's absence, there's arrival, then there's a stage of population increase before we get to persistence. And there can be backwards and forwards between those steps, but it's obviously not that clear cut where we define the range edge. How far does that range edge need to shift before we count it as a range shift? Is that 1 kilometre? Is it 5 kilometres? Does that depend on the scale of the original distribution or the characteristics of the species in the first place? So that might differ between different species. And when does it count? Is that 1 year, 5 years? Is it 10 years? So a lot of these parameters haven't really been well articulated in a lot of the studies that are reporting range shifts. It's also obviously a very complicated process with lots of other changes occurring at the same time. So we talk about species needing to adapt, move, or die, but plasticity, adaptation, and movement are not mutually exclusive, and those processes are occurring in different ways and to different extents in different parts of a species distribution. So we need to examine our ecological and our evolutionary understanding of some of these processes in the core parts of distribution, what we call the leading edge, where species are extending. And I just realised most people are probably Northern Hemisphere and I'm using Southern Hemisphere arm waving to talk about extensions, but moving polewards. And then the trailing edge, the warm edge that's retracting. So there's a lot of processes within a species distribution, and yet when we talk about range shifts, we're talking about you know, gross levels of movement at one edge of the distribution. There's also a lot of other changes happening in systems, and just one example of one of those changes from an Australian system for one of our recent studies is changes in body size. So this study, led by Asta Oidzanita, was using reef life survey data, so another citizen science program that uses very highly structured scuba surveys from highly trained divers, looking at the distribution and the sizes of species all around reef areas. And what that data over 20 years showed was that there were a lot of changes in body size, but a whole stack of species were getting smaller in warmer waters, and then other species were getting larger. So we didn't have a consistent trend in terms of the change of sizes of these species. And that quite rapid change in body size and variable change in body size obviously might have unexpected impacts in terms of ecosystem restructuring. It's not, I mean, it would still be complicated if we had all species were shrinking or all species were growing, but where we have this pattern of, you know, roughly 55% of species getting smaller and 45% getting bigger, that can obviously have some really large potential implications for the structure and function of that ecosystem. So a lot of changes in species distributions, other processes occurring, and then some other large changes, like changes in body size. But in terms of range shifts, we know that those ecological consequences of range shifting species can be equivalent to invasive species. Absolutely not in all cases. Many species may change distribution that could lead to positive impacts, or we might not notice at all, but there is absolutely the potential for species to act as invasive species. And the example from our region of the world is the long-spine sea urchin, which is moving into Tasmanian waters along our east coast. As the winter temperature there reaches 12 or 13 degrees, which is the threshold for survival for the larvae. The larvae are able to survive in much larger numbers. It's quite a complicated issue to do with changes in size in the rock lobster industry and heat-related declines in kelp as well. So again, another conundrum wrapped up in an enigma. But the basic, one of the key underlying issues is these large numbers of urchins that can now survive on the East Coast and are creating urchin barrens. But that's occurring in a region where there are a large number of other species changes, and we don't know a lot about the impact of multiple shifting species. So we often, where we have looked at impacts of shifting species, it's been on a species by species basis, but in some parts of the world, we are having large numbers of species all enter and leave systems at the same time, and understanding the impacts about those multiple shifting species and the novel ecosystems that they may create hasn't been examined in detail in many cases. So there's issues around the definition of what is a novel ecosystem. How do we, define those elements of stability and structure and function? And a lot of the management decisions come down to often our human values, which obviously vary between regions and between stakeholders. We have had a look at trying to look at the ecological impact of multiple species through some qualitative network analysis. So we looked at 3 range shifting species moving into a region, gloomy octopus, snapper, and that long spine sea urchin. And I won't go into this study, but I just wanted to say that the net impact of those shifting species was unexpected, or rather the role of some of these species. So the octopus here, for example, which we may not have perceived to have been an issue, looks like it might actually be indirectly backing up the role of the urchin, which is an impact that we are deeply concerned about. So that study just highlighted to us that we really do need to go in and try and look at the cumulative impact of large numbers of species changing distribution in particular areas. But these shifts in distribution matter because they change ecosystem structure and function, or they can change ecosystem structure and function. They can be relevant for food security in many parts of the world. Human health can also be an issue in terms of species that are either dangerous in terms of they bite us or they eat us, rip us in half, those sorts of things. We have shifting crocodiles and shifting sharks in Australia, but also diseases that affect humans are another very common response to climate change that we're seeing in our part of the world. People's livelihoods often depend on these species or on the diseases that impact them. Feedbacks to the climate system are also really important. So mangroves, for example, sequester large amounts of carbon from the atmosphere and affect the local climate. And we are seeing die-offs of mangroves as waters become too warm. And then, of course, human culture as well. And I mean culture in many different contexts. That could be in a local context. We like to go fishing and diving off our particular coasts. It could be in a more traditional context, people that live very traditional lifestyles, or Indigenous cultures around the world that have very, very close attachments to species that just can't be replaced by something else. So these shifts in distribution matter for a whole lot of reasons. But when we think about the reasons why countries usually battle, it's either over territory, religion, or resources. And now we are living through a redistribution of the life on Earth. And so there's the potential there for a lot of disputes and challenges and conflict to arise as a result of these changes in distribution. And we are already seeing many of these issues crop up around the world. So it's not really surprising to see that we have a large amount of research effort looking at the redistribution of species and the potential impacts of those. Timothy Bonebrake, as part of a number of studies that emerged out of a conference called Species on the Move, looked at the evolution and the development of this field of redistribution ecology, or climate-driven species redistributions. And he was able to show that, we've had 1,600 publications in the last 25 years. are looking at this issue. That first graph there looks at the proportion of publications in the field of ecology and environmental sciences. And the other panel there, panel B, is the number of journals publishing this material. But it's been a very rapid increase in papers that are explicitly trying to address this issue. So I think it is actually a really fascinating and unprecedented opportunity for us to learn about ecology and evolution and what makes species live where they do in the first place. In many ways, climate change is a massive experiment on the planet. I think it's a pretty crappy experiment and there's no independent replicates. But there is that opportunity for us to really try and understand why species live where they do in the first place, while we can examine that through the lens of these rapid changes that we're seeing now and the various drivers that are underpinning that. So there is a great need, though, as well as it being interesting from an ecological point of view, for us to develop our field of explanatory ecology and then predictive ecology as well, to try and keep on top of what some of these changes might be. So it is a really rapidly developing field, and there's an awful lot of literature coming out that's incredibly hard to keep on top of. So because there is so much information coming out at the moment, we wanted to look at range shifts around Australia. So we did that through a structured literature review of published papers, and we really wanted to try and describe the nature and the extent of this issue around Australia, so that we could see what the critical gaps were and what we knew so far. So we were able to document a large number of redistributions around the country. And remember, Australia has typically very data poor regions. So I think the fact that we were able to describe around 200 changes in species distribution just since 2003, signifies the extent of this challenge. So Tasmania, so it's the island state at the bottom of Australia here, circled in orange and corresponding to the bar in orange there, that had the largest numbers of changes in distribution, and most of those were range extensions. That eastern part of Australia in the blue region there, that was really the only region where we were seeing a lot of range contractions. So around 23% of those changes in distribution were range contractions, so the species contracting at that warmer edge. And in Western Australia, so the area in grey there, a lot of those changes in distribution that had been recorded were analysed and reported to be a result of marine heat waves that were facilitating the range extension of more tropical species in that region. But we were also able to show that we think that a lot of these studies are focused around regions of commercial importance or either high human population. And there's also a spatial bias that we are acutely aware of in terms of the climate change research effort in Australia. So this pattern of higher shifts in Tasmania, Western Australia, Eastern Australia, that almost exactly mirrors the pattern of general marine climate change information research being published in those regions. So that could obviously be part of the explanation for why we're seeing a large number of species shifting in Tasmania. But there is also another very compelling reason, which I'll show you shortly. In terms of the trajectories of a lot of these species that are changing distribution, this graph here shows the numbers of species shifting via, along the bottom there is the type of change in distribution that we were seeing. And the stars on the top there indicate changes that are consistent with what we'd expect under climate change or with climate velocity. So you can see that the vast majority of those shifts are poleward expansions or extensions of that range edge in fish and invertebrates. We're also seeing significant bias, as I mentioned, in the species that are being reported. Most of those are fish species or inshore reef species. Importantly, we are usually only seeing one range edge observed in studies. So most studies are only examining that range extension edge. So we're not getting a lot of good information about that contraction process. When we look at the taxa of different shifting species around the country and the data sources that underpin those, this map shows, we've placed the little circles on land, but obviously there are changes along the coast, but the size of those circles of the different classes indicate the proportion of shifts attributed to that or occurring within that class. And you can see we've had to expand out Tasmania here to accommodate the relative size of those circles there. So we've had, as I mentioned earlier, 198 species from 9 phyla that have been documented changing their distribution. For the fish, most of that information comes from citizen science, from historical baseline surveys, and from commercial catch data. When we looked at algae, a lot of that is from herbarium historic data. And then the invertebrates are also from historical survey baselines. So different kinds of information are contributing to our understanding of these changes, but there is a desperate need for more structured, rigorous, scientific, continued monitoring to really facilitate us being able to understand these changes. So, you know, I've mentioned we've had lots of changes in the island state of Tasmania. And so it's not surprising that that's where we started this project Redmap that Felisa mentioned at the start there, the range extension database and mapping project. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But when we had that high level look at the changes around Australia, in line with the Chris Brown paper that talked about the methodology contributing a lot of the variation that we're seeing in range shifts, our study around Australia revealed little standardisation in the methods and the metrics reported. Most of the documented shifts were species in subtropical and temperate systems, with very few tropical species or tropical systems explored. And most of those changes were only described at that poleward boundary. We found one study that looked at both ends of a species distribution within the one study, and then only about 4 species that had actually been examined at both ends of the distribution in a number of studies. So we've got very little information, and particularly very little structured information about both ends of distributions. So we really are hindered by a lack of baselines. Australia has, you know, 35,000 to 60,000 kilometres of coastline, depending on how you measure it. And so it's a very broad coastline for, you know, relatively low population and low number of scientists to try and understand. Our review, though, did demonstrate the importance of these historical data sets in the underwater visual surveys. And around 1/5 of the studies incorporated citizen science. So it really highlighted the importance of contributions from the public. So I mentioned Redmap, the range extension database and mapping project that started in Tasmania because we were hearing lots of anecdotal information from recreational and commercial fishers that they were seeing new species turn up. And as it turns out, Tasmania is warming at around 4 times the global average. So that East Australian current that pushes down the east coast, that current that brought Nemo's dad cruising down the coast in the Disney movie, that pushes down in summer and it retreats in winter, and it's strengthening. So the atmosphere above the Pacific Ocean, the warming of that atmosphere is literally spinning up the gyre or strengthening the wind fields there, and that's literally physically forcing the East Australian current further down our coast. So in Tasmania, we get a double whammy. We get the underlying warming that most of the rest of the ocean has, and we also have this change in current system that is leading to nutrient poor waters and warmer waters in that region. So we have had a lot of changes. There's that poleward expansion of the sea urchin that I mentioned earlier. There's new octopus species turning up that are now 15% of the octopus fishery in a part of our coast. We have 50% of our intertidal species have moved much further polewards in the last 50 years. Dozens of new fish species that have had major distributional changes. And we could probably formally go through processes that we've used with the Redmap data in that Robinson et al. Paper, redo that, and I would think we could add a few dozen more to that category now. And around 85% of our seaweeds have shifted further south as well. So that's a large number of changes in terms of distribution. And we've also had a couple of very significant recent events in Tasmania. So about 5 years or so ago, we had a very significant heat wave event. It was over 250 days long, up to 3 and 4 degrees warmer than average at some points throughout that time. That led to paralytic shellfish toxins in mussels, scallops, oysters, clams, a whole lot of species. That was a species that we had in our waters before, but it was a new strain of the Alexandrium that was producing the neurotoxin and leading to large closures of the fishery and no-take zones and a whole lot of problems. So big global product recalls and a lot of financial losses for the industry. And there was also a virus causing Pacific oyster mortality syndrome that was first detected towards the end of that heat wave, and up to 90% of all those farmed oysters died. So that was a really major concern for the industry. So for us, we wanted to know what had been the response of our different stakeholder groups to all of these changes in distribution and then these shocks from the marine heat wave. So we were quite aware that there was limited government action on fisheries, and that's a global phenomenon. There seems to be a lot of talk about research, very good research on potential adaptation options and potential responses, but there's very little rubber hitting the road at this point in time. So we started working with different groups and collating all the autonomous adaptation actions that people were aware of. And so by autonomous, I mean things that industry could do or different stakeholder groups could do without particular management actions or responses being recommended or forced on them. So we looked at divers, recreational fishers, commercial fishers, charter operators, and then different types of aquaculture. And we expected to find a couple of responses, but we were actually pretty astounded to find, I think it was around 26 different autonomous adaptation options that different stakeholder groups were undertaking. So charter operators were advertising trips for new species. It was like, yeah, yellowtail kingfish is available in Tasmania now. Come out and you know, on the charter boats and target these species. They're very popular recreational species. There were a lot of changes to product handling and landing practices, in particular in abalone and in rock lobster. So the rock lobster industry, for example, they have live wells in the bottom of their boat, and that water coming into that live well is obviously whatever the water in the surrounding environment is, whatever temperature that is. And to avoid offloading their product in warmer waters, they're actually steaming much further south and unloading their product in cooler waters to try and preserve the product and prevent die-offs. So there were some big changes in movements and landing practices. There was also changes to farming practices, so things like densities and sizes and feed times and all of those kinds of things. And industry is using seasonal forecasting for farm management. So the interesting part of this was individual groups and people were sort of aware of a couple of things that were happening, but it wasn't until we actually collated everything that they, you know, developed this awareness of exactly how adaptive and how many responses had been undertaken. And many of these changes, management were not aware of. So management didn't know that a lot of these changes were occurring. And it led us to sort of speculate that individuals, organisations and communities are much more agile and adaptive in terms of responding to climate change than perhaps our management structures are at this point in time. We went ahead and characterised these adaptation options according to some typologies of adaptation. So adaptation actions can be things like capacity building or practice change or, warning and observing systems. And when we went and characterised all the adaptations that we've documented, they were mainly in these categories that I've highlighted here in orange. So they were mainly around capacity building, practice change, information, warning or observing systems, and some technology developments. But the critical part of that study was that around half of these autonomous adaptations were potentially countervailing to what planned government-led adaptations could be. So it really highlighted to us that there is a lot of activity happening in terms of responses on the ground, and there's a lot of planning in terms of government-led adaptations, but there's not a lot of knowledge and exchange between those, and that we perhaps need to be capturing these autonomous adaptations in a much more structured, rigorous, or at least consistent kind of way, so that we can ensure that those autonomous adaptations are occurring in line with government-led adaptation, or that those two processes are supporting each other instead of potential maladaptations occurring, for example. So climate change will bring opportunities as well as negative implications. Some increases in abundance and changes in distribution will be favourable, like this snapper that we're seeing in Tasmania. There's a lot of people, not just this woman, that are particularly excited about snapper moving into Tasmania. However, those new opportunities also need to have management underpinning those as well to ensure that we're maximising those. The other thing that was emerged from our study is that some implications of climate change cannot be adapted to, and we absolutely need to keep that in mind. So an example from Tasmania there is the Marinere rainbow kelp shell, which is declining in abundance according to Indigenous communities in Tasmania. The shells are apparently also getting thinner, and this is a shell that the Aboriginal women in Tasmania experience a lot of their governance of sea country through, and it's not simply a species that they can replace with something else. And I think as we're talking about adaptation and changing what we do, we need to be quite cognizant of the fact that that can't always occur for many people. So adaptation to climate change is very complicated and messy. There's limited planned adaptation at the government level. Very low awareness of non-government adaptations. It's multi-sector, multi-stakeholder. There's lots of competing values and interests. And ultimately adaptation to climate change will in many cases mean winners and losers and trade-offs and lots of value-based decisions. So who gets to make those decisions, I think, is a really important question. And we need to ensure that we're using interdisciplinary, participatory and integrated approaches wherever we can. So, and I think these challenges apply at local scales and at global scales, or whatever scale we are looking at. In terms of global scales, which I'll shift to now, we had a study published yesterday that looked at what does the future hold for species redistribution and adaptation at a global scale? And it's part of a much larger study called Future Seas, which looked at developing alternative futures in a range of different contexts. So we were working in really large interdisciplinary teams and generating evidence-based descriptions of the future in terms of business as usual, where we're headed if we keep doing what we're doing, but also what was technically possible sustainable future. So if we pushed in line with the Sustainable Development Goals, how far could we get for that particular issue? So it wasn't us deciding what the future could look like, it was seeing how far we could push to be in line with the Sustainable Development goals. So the futures that we developed in this project are plausible and evidence informed. The point of them wasn't the precision and the detail, but it was actually to work out a pathway of actions to move towards achieving that future. So essentially our question was, what could the future look like if the knowledge we had already available was actually used? So it was really trying to highlight that the difference between a business as usual and a sustainable future in many cases is not gaps in our knowledge, it's gaps in our implementation. And more importantly, we're trying to look at how could we get to that more sustainable future. So as I mentioned, Future Seas was a very large project that looked at a range of issues, and I've got many of those listed there, but species climate-driven redistribution was one of those. And we developed these two futures through a process called foresighting, which uses physical, ecological, socio-economic trends to imagine the future, and then backcasting to develop a pathway of actions at local, regional and global scales and to achieve that particular future. So there's a methods paper that underpins many of these futures. That's Nash et al. In Reviews in Fish Biology and Fisheries. And then the particular redistribution paper I'll show you in a minute. So this whole project had 130 people in it in different teams that were focused on each of these challenges. We developed those two futures, the business as usual and the sustainable technically possible future. And this whole it was very workshop based, so trawling through literature and synthesizing information, and then a whole lot of workshops and expert opinion based processes. And it was very interdisciplinary, very multi-knowledge system. So we had Indigenous and traditional knowledge holders as part of the project, and a very holistic approach to outlining this pathway to the sustainable future. So for the issue of species redistribution through these processes, we arrived at some key drivers that will shape the future outcome of species redistribution at a global scale. So this was a paper out yesterday. It's called Poleward Bound, Adapting to Climate-Driven Species Redistribution. It was led by Jessica Melbourne-Thomas from the CSIRO with a lot of other fabulous co-authors. And through those foresighting processes, we were able to arrive at the conclusion that monitoring and detection, the scale of management and the cooperation between jurisdictions will be the three key issues that really underpin how much adaptation can occur at different scales to be effective in terms of adapting to climate change for species redistribution. There's obviously a lot of feedbacks and information flows that occur between those four key drivers of change. So depending on how effective we are as a planet in acting on those four drivers, the monitoring, detection, scale of management, cooperation between jurisdictions and adaptation, we've got two potential futures, obviously lots more than that, but the two that we were describing. So our business as usual future, which we call chasing our tails and our fish. This is a future that would be more passive and reactive, unconnected in terms of information transfer, very nationalistic and individualistic processes, the growth economy, short-term planning, lots of focus on sovereignty and access and who gets what, and lags between detection and management responses. But technically, we could head towards a future that was more a dynamic adaptation to a moving feast, that was adaptive and proactive. There was high information transfer between regions and systems, and it's more of a collaborative and cooperative economy where there's an emphasis on stewardship, long-term planning, shared resources, and real-time monitoring and adaptive management. So there's, oops, I've flicked forward some slides there. So a lot of these goals depend on political will, government will, and people understanding the issue and supporting these changes. In the paper, I should mention, there is a pathway of actions at short, medium and long-term timescales that articulate that we could technically get to this future, but it's very detailed, so I won't go into that here. But it did really highlight to us those issues of communication in terms of policy and in terms of public. And that's where I'll flip to just a few slides on climate change communication. And we all know that climate change communication in general is very challenging. It's a complex, non-linear problem. If I want to explain to public or policy around an issue that's linear. My brain can do that very easily. People's brains are trained to do that. You know, how much money do I spend at the coffee shop each day? $5. I can calculate that on a linear basis, and people can sort of do that automatically. But climate change is very complex. It's non-linear. There's feedbacks. There's a lot of uncertainty, and too much information can actually lead to inaction. In addition to that, our brains are just wired to completely ignore climate change if we don't like it. So there's issues like motivated reasoning and confirmation bias. If I have a particular view, I can go and find information that fits that view, or as new information comes into me, if it doesn't fit, I'll just ignore it, and I accept the information that confirms what I already believe. Everybody does that to certain extents. And there's things about climate change itself that make it really easy for people to ignore. It's too far into the future, it's too big to believe, and there's something called the bystander effect, where the more people that are standing by watching something, the less action happens. But in terms of climate change, you know, that poses one of our most serious threats to biodiversity and to human societies, but it's just really easy for people to not engage with because it's perceived to be so distant, and it's, you know, perceived to be something that you know, people can't really impact, and there's a lot of potential for psychological distance from the issues there. But when we're talking and communicating about climate change, we can have a positive impact if we're respecting people's differences, we're listening to people, we're moving beyond those left and right politics, and in particular that we value people's values. And that's where I'll get into the species on the move issue. So using communication that is about both processing systems in the brain, the experience, learning by doing, and the analysis, facts and figures aspects can be really potentially helpful. So we have a paper in review at the moment in Nature, Ecology and Evolution, and it's called Climate-Driven Species on the Move Provide Tangible Anchors to Engage the Public on Climate Change. And this was a collaboration with psychologists and people working in communication, specifically research on communication. And we looked at how species changing distribution present an opportunity for us as a scientific community to engage people on climate change by linking to the values that they might have. And there's a range of values people have, and species on the move present the opportunity for a range of values. By linking to those values and the deep connections that people have in the places that they live and work, but in a globally coherent narrative. So climate change, shifting where species live, and I think it's through the importance that people place on these aspects of life that species on the move offer the potential to connect to emotional pathways on this complicated issue of climate change in a way that can potentially generate interest and action. So people in the community experience species on the move. There's an opportunity there for us to frame those messages on climate change in different ways. And people that research communication and engagement know that the framing of the message that we give people can determine whether it's effective or not in different circumstances. Likewise, the different emotions that causes can also lead to people switching on and off. So in this paper, we've explained the potential for these different frames in different situations that can lead to potentially productive outcomes around conversations. So for example, with the long-spine sea urchin, we can use a problem solution frame where we highlight, you know, the impact of the urchins and explain that we need to stop this spread before it more heavily affects our important fishing industries, but then highlight the solution or part solution, which is that new urchin harvesting industry will reduce the numbers of the urchins while also providing jobs and employment for the community. And that is actually happening as a solution to this issue off our coast. But it's a frame that can connect with people that are interested in jobs and employment, for example. So it's a problem solution frame. And there's many examples that we go through in the paper about that. But I think species on the move is an opportunity to communicate with people, whatever species you have moving around in your regions, in a way that taps into people's place-based attachment, and it makes climate change locally relevant and tangible to people. And of course, there's also a lot of opportunities for people to connect to climate change through participation. So it's a behavioural aspect to the engagement and the communication as well, through issues like citizen science or through projects like citizen science. And in this paper, we document a range of different types of communication activities that are already occurring specifically around species on the move. And then we outline another whole potential range of approaches that people could use to try and connect their local communities and stakeholders on the issue of climate change. So in summary, species are shifting and fundamentally changing our natural and our managed systems. Because we've got around at least 40 years of warming locked into the atmosphere at the moment, species on the move will be the foreseeable future, even if we stopped putting greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere today, we'd still have that 40 years of warming. Almost everything is changing all at once, so lots of different changes in distribution and changes in size and adaptation at that species level occurring. We desperately need a mechanistic-based processed understanding in order to predict those future changes. We're also seeing lots of impacts in our human systems. Adaptation is absolutely possible within limits, but we need strategic planning, and probably more importantly, we need that implementation gap between what we know and what could actually happen to be reduced. And part of that might be this opportunity for using species on the move as communication vehicles to try and connect people on climate change more generally in a way that's locally relevant to them. So I'd like to thank you very much for listening, and I'd love to hear any questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was fabulous. So what I think we will like to do now, Greta, is turn it over to ask for folks to ask some of the questions they've been pasting in the chat box and or to raise their hand if they have a question. But I'm going to go through the chat box and turn on the people that ask questions so that they can actually ask their questions, right? So Denise, you had a question for Greta. Do you want to go ahead and ask it?
Oh, yes. So at the beginning, you were mentioning that there were about 55% of the species were getting larger. Is there like a trend? Are there particular groups that are changing, that are getting larger or smaller? Is it like herbivores or carnivores or anything like it?
Yes, there were particular trends. So it was more, I would have to go back and look at the detail, because there was 335 species that were examined in that study. And Asteroids is the lead on that. From memory, it was if species got smaller as they shifted geographically into, like as you looked across their latitude, if they got smaller in warmer parts of their latitude, then they also got smaller with warming across time, and vice versa. If they were larger in the warmer parts of their latitude, then they got bigger as the warming occurred. But I would need to go and check that. But it wasn't all of one taxa did one thing and all of one taxa did another. But there were relationships there that related to the traits.
It's very cool. Actually, I'm going to just interject a quick question here. Did this have anything to do with growth rates increasing for the taxa that got larger? Was that because the growth quickened because of warming waters? Because we do expect, yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we could actually determine that from the study. It could be a range of factors that would lead to that pattern. Right. Yeah, and we probably suggested about 4 or 5 different potential pathways, but it would certainly be an interesting avenue to explore.
Clearly have to read that paper. Siri had 2 or 3 questions in the chat. I'm gonna, I've turned you on, and if you want to maybe just pick one of those to ask right now.
Okay. Now, yeah, my first question is, now you used the term redistribution ecology, but at the global scale, can we also, can we call it redistribution biogeography or identify such a field?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of interesting discussions in the field about the terminology that we should be using. So for example, some people use range expansion, others use range extension. There's a big call to be clear about when we're talking about range. Many people talk about range shifts, but actually they're just talking about range extensions. So there is a lot of clarity that I think we need to introduce into the field. Mm-hmm. I often talk about climate-driven species redistribution. There are people that want to call it redistribution ecology to try and bring in the more ecological aspects, that it's not just the species. Yeah, I'm not sure what else to add about that.
Okay. Lorenzo, if you want to go ahead and ask your question.
Sure, thank you. So the first question was regarding the citizen science projects, but it may also affect other projects. So I think they're great to engage public, but I think they may suffer from very strong biases towards the geographical and the taxonomical level at which the observations are recorded. So could you share some thoughts on how to tackle this issue?
Yeah, absolutely, I can. So for starters, you hear a lot of conversations about, is citizen science useful? And the framing of that sometimes really frustrates me, because we wouldn't say, is ecology useful or is chemistry useful? We would talk about particular methods and approaches in particular contexts, and then have a discussion about, is that approach fit for purpose? So in the context of citizen science, for example, the study that I showed from Asta Oidzanita, looking at the changes in body size around the coast, that citizen science program was called Reef Life Survey. In that particular project, they are highly trained scuba divers. They undergo assessments and tests for their accuracy. And the information has been evaluated coming out of that program, where they're undertaking very highly structured underwater visual census surveys. That information has been evaluated to be as accurate as the scientific trained divers. So that's been through an evaluation process. It's structured presence absence information, and it's really no different to the underwater scuba surveys from trained divers. In the context of Redmap, so the range extension database and mapping project, in that project, it's people out fishing and diving, and they see something unusual and they go, oh, that's a coral trout off the coast of Tasmania. That doesn't belong here. They take a photo, they upload it via an app or our website. The expert for that particular species gets sent a link. The expert clicks on the link, verifies the photo, verifies that the metadata, like the reported location in the photo, matches the metadata. There's a whole lot of checks and balances that take place there. We use that information as an early indication of what species might be changing distribution. So we do not say that every observation that's seen out of range is a range extension, but we have been able to use that information in things like the octopus species that I mentioned. We started getting reports of a new octopus species on the north coast of Tasmania. We had very poor information about its historical distribution. So we got a PhD student on to study that species and look at the mitochondrial DNA throughout its whole range and in this potential new part of the range. And that study reinforced the assessment that had been a recent rapid range extension into that area. And when we then talked to the commercial fishers in that area, they all said, oh yeah, we've been seeing this new species since 2005. And so they only had to report it to the management agency as octopus. So they've just been writing octopus, however many kilos, but they've been keeping their own records. And so they had the evolution of the arrival of this species in their fishing records. So that's an example of how we use that. But the information coming in from that particular citizen science project is opportunistic, presence only information. But we have been able to go through a number of processes, and it's the Robinson et al. 2015 paper that develops decision tree processes for how certain we were of the distribution in the first place, and then looking at the characteristics of the new observations coming in. So are they in repeated years? Are they in winter? What's the detectability of the species? All these other issues, and arrives at a likelihood of range extension. And when that likelihood comes out as high, that's when we will then go and put a dedicated project around it. But I think they're very good questions to ask, but that the question shouldn't be, is citizen science useful for this or not? It's, is this particular program in this particular context fit for that purpose, is the conversation that I think is the one we need to have. Does that make sense?
Oh, I just turned him off. Sorry.
Okay.
Well,
he agrees. He agrees. That's
Sorry,
fine. Next question.
Jan Christopher, you had a question.
Yes, I had a question. Thank you very much. So it's very interesting to hear your opinion about citizen science, and also my question goes a bit into this direction, because among those groups you mentioned that are actually shifting ranges, marine mammals are not listed. And I would just be interested, is this because there's no data? I would imagine, I mean, citizen science and whale watching operations, there should be quite a good data source there. I would just be interested in what you would say to this.
So I think there likely are marine mammals around the world that are changing distribution. In Australia, many of our marine mammals have very wide distributions anyway. And then there's another couple of species that we have very poor distribution information on. So I don't think there's actually been a formal assessment of whether or not marine mammals around Australia are actually changing distribution. So I wouldn't be able to answer that question, but we do have quite a few observations of particular large species, not necessarily mammals, but large species do tend to be reported more obviously. So manta rays, for example, citizen scientists are reporting those, and they do look like they are shifting further south. Whale sharks off our west coast in particular. But we don't have a good lot of historical data for many species in Australia, and that includes marine mammals. But there certainly is a lot of opportunity there. And in fact, one of my children that wants to be a marine scientist, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, is about to do an internship at a marine mammal conservation branch, where his job will be to go through Facebook photos of whales and try and classify them.
Cool, thanks. Thank you.
So Alex.
Hi, Greta. Hope you can hear me.
Hi.
We know that the land is warming faster than the ocean. So there's kind of an expectation that climate velocities would be faster on land than ocean. So do we know why the marine species are moving so much faster?
As it turns out, I've got a list here, which was from the Donaldson et al. Paper on adaptation and, in terms of species, not in terms of humans, and evolution, plasticity, adaptation and evolution. And we put a table in there about why this issue of range shifts was occurring more in marine systems, or occurring faster in marine systems than on land. And it's things like marine species typically fill more of their fundamental niche than terrestrial species. So terrestrial species often have a bit of wiggle room, if you like, whereas marine species, they're often at their full breadth, and any change means they've got to shift. So a lot of that is Jennifer Sunday's exceptional work from Canada. Marine species tend to have larger geographical distributions in the first place. There's issues or things around the larval stages that leads to high dispersal and high migration. So there are a whole lot of reasons around barriers in particular as well. So species on land have more barriers sort of interfering with the processes. So there are quite a few reasons for why this process might be happening faster. in the ocean.
Okay, so Adam, you had put a question in the chat, but I've made you live. So I'm going to assume he, for some reason, can't be live, but his question was, if climate-driven species redistribution is likely to bring forth potential biological invasions, should climate-driven species be recognized by invasive alien species policies and environmental law? And is that a problem that can be addressed in legal terms, or are there other means of handling it's more appropriate?
They can be addressed in legal terms. And I think he might have sent this question in to you earlier. And I actually conferred with a colleague of mine, Philippa McCormack, who was fascinated by the question and said she might actually put a student on a project looking at the different laws that are being developed around the place. So in Europe, for example, I think they have a recognition that climate-driven species should not be considered as alien. But, you know, Europe's a region, obviously, where there are many borders within the one landmass, and then places like Australia and New Zealand, our general approach to biosecurity is much stricter and much more different. And I wasn't aware of this, but in Tasmania, we've actually got a new act that's been developed in stages in 2019 and 2021 that actually says if an animal moves into Tasmania, and it might be indigenous to other parts of Australia, but if it wasn't in Tasmania before, even if it's coming of its own accord, that it can be considered a pest if we don't like the impact of it. So that brings us back to that issue of human values. And there's a paper with Brett Sheffers in Nature Climate Change from 2019, where he and I talked about that issue of the way that changes in distribution have been dealt with in the past are a balance of ecological impact and social values, or not necessarily a balance, a mix that can be applied perhaps randomly. And we were highlighting that there really does need to be some proactive aspects and some consistency in how we evaluate and view a lot of these changes in distribution, because some people will like the impacts and some people won't. But it was very interesting to see that in our legislation here in Tasmania, we can just say, oh, it's a native range extender, but we'll call it invasive, we'll make it a pest so we can get rid of it. So I thought that was really interesting. Whereas Europe seems to be the opposite approach. It's if it's moving here of its own accord, it's welcome.
Christoph Patterson.
Cool. Hey, thanks for a really cool talk. I was curious if you knew sort of the causal link. So you showed that graph of warming seas, warming waters being brought to Tasmania by the EAC.
Yep.
Are the species that are arriving in Tasmania, have the larvae of those species always been coming to Tasmania and they just haven't been able to survive because the water isn't warm enough? Or is the increasing strength of the EAC actually bringing new pelagic larvae to that area?
That has not been examined in a rigorous X% do this, X% do that kind of way. However, we do know that in some cases, it's your first suggestion there that things have always been coming, but now they can actually survive. And in other species cases, it's that the adults are now physically moving into that area. And I don't think we know about the larvae in many cases, whether they were always coming here and then just dying or whatever. So it is absolutely a mix of those things. Yeah. And that's why it makes it such an interesting, problem to try and unravel. The devil's absolutely in the detail, even though we have these, high level statements of species adapting and moving where they live in response to climate. In many of the cases, it's just changes in survivorship, or a predator species might have moved on to another region and now they survive. So it's not always a abiotic factor. It can be biotic factors that that change the survival patterns as well of these species.
So there are two other questions in the chat, but I think those two people have had to leave. So let me go ahead and read them out to you. One was just, I loved the presentation. That's always good to hear. I wanted to know a couple of things. What can be done today and what can I do as a science student to help prevent it from happening?
Okay, well, we're not going to prevent species redistribution, unfortunately. However, we can have a really large impact in how effective our response can be to those changes. I guess that was the point of that last, or the second last paper that I showed you about the two futures, was we really wanted to map out what were those actions that on short, medium and longer term timescales. There were a couple there that I think are really important and are probably things that should be happening anyway. One of those was supporting Indigenous rights and access. So the IPBES, I never know how to say that acronym, report that came out recently was very clear that although biodiversity wasn't on a great track in most parts of the world, where it was either doing well or doing less bad, were Indigenous controlled areas around the world. So Indigenous rights and access is something that I think should be happening anyway, but from a scientific outcome perspective, I think there's, you know, an impelling argument there for us to be much more open to Indigenous management and Indigenous knowledge. So that's one thing I think people could be vocal about doing. Another is about the communication and the engagement. I think that our job isn't done until our science is communicated. That doesn't mean everybody needs to communicate to the public, because I think we all need to play to our strengths and that varies, but it means someone in your team needs to be communicating that science. And there's a number of ways that that can happen in. They can be low budget versions, they can be high end versions, but I'd encourage people to look at that. Hopefully comes out in Nature, Environment and Ecology and Evolution about using species on the move. And it talks about how medical people can talk about moving mosquitoes and diseases, and you know, agricultural people can talk about moving pests and things like that. That there's a whole range of different aspects of this redistribution problem that we can talk about in really locally relevant ways, but are a part of a coherent global narrative about this redistribution of life on Earth. Yeah, so there's a few things, but in that paper, there's more concrete sort of things to look at as well.
So,
I noticed that.
So two last questions. Rob Colwell has a question. I'm going to let him ask it, and then I'll ask you the last one, which was from
Okay.
Sarah. So Rob, go ahead.
Hi, Rob.
That was a great talk. What you were talking about a minute ago about legal processes differing across the globe with regard to species moving in that may or may not be wanted. I wondered if you know of any cases in which a species moving out of a place where it was highly valued has resulted in legal action against fossil fuel companies or governments.
No, I don't actually. Yeah, I don't.
We should get some of those.
Yes, we should. But some of the work so we had, you know, so Rob came along to the first Species on the Move. You were at the second one, I think. Is that right, Rob? Yes. Yeah. So the workshop that we had after that Species on the Move, there's a paper being led at the moment by Brett Sheffers that looks at the numbers of species going over jurisdictional boundaries, exiting and entering different jurisdictions. And that's revealing huge numbers of species that by different temperature thresholds and different date levels, so, you know, 2050, 2100, that will be completely leaving some jurisdictions and going into others. So that issue that you talk about could be very significant if plants or animals are leaving a jurisdiction with a reasonable you know, approach to management and going into another jurisdiction where perhaps there are less stringent you know, ways of looking after them.
Thank you.
Okay, so the last question is by Sergio, and as a paleoecologist, I think this is a great place to leave it. So go ahead, Sergio.
Yeah.
Hi, Greta. So it's
Hi.
thanks for your great talk. I'm literally talking to you from the other side of the globe. I'm in the Azores.
Oh, cool.
Yes, it must be about around 12 hours or 13 hours of difference. Anyway, my question is this. For the last 20 years, we have been studying and comparing the geographical range expansions and contractions between the last interglacial and the present times here in the Macaronesia. So I work in Azores, Madeira, Canary Islands, and Cabo Verde. And my question to you is, I would be really interested if you know or if you are aware of any data that can compare between what happens in oceanic island systems and what happens in continental shores. Do you know if in Australia you have data from the last interglacial fossiliferous deposits that also attest for these geographical range expansions or contractions? And what is, if you have that, do you know or do you have any idea about how fast this has happened? Because from our data, I believe that the last glacial, the transition from the last glacial episode to the last interglacial, so this is a glacial termination. The velocity of the changes were much faster than the changes that are happening nowadays.
Okay, that's really interesting to know. In terms of data in Australia, absolutely not my area, but I do know who you would ask or who I could direct that question to for you, and that's Damien Fordham from Adelaide. So he looks at more paleo climate and shifts over deep time. In terms of the relative rate to the particular period that you mentioned, I'm not entirely sure. I know there are studies that have compared rates over deep time, but I'm not sure which exact time period and now, and mentioned that they were 5 times faster now than the deep time period. So I would have to go and look at what that particular study was to mention it to you, but I'm only aware of it because one of my postgrads just cited it in his thesis, and I was like, oh, that's handy. A reference that compared the relative rates, but again, I'm not sure what the geographic scale or the time scale of that was. But I would be
Sergio's point. The terminus of the Younger Dryas around 11,500 years ago, the warming was 5 to 6 degrees in a couple of decades. So that's specifically looked at the best proxy probably. So that's not even that deep a time. Everything that's alive today was alive then. But of course they could move because there weren't cities. So there are some
makes it quite different.
Yeah, it makes it much, much different. You have more potential ways of coping, right? You can adapt, you can move and so forth. And that is something that paleoecologists such as myself and others do work on. So it'd be interesting to compare it. But anyway, we have taken a long time, a lot of your time. We are very grateful. Your talk was fabulous and we all enjoyed it. And it will be posted on the IBS website as we put in the chat. And I would suggest to folks that if you have further questions for Greta, that you email her. Is that okay?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. All right. And thank you very, very much.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.